Hey, what is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. I'm finally back. I have been dealing with some bronchitis recently, but I'm back with another review, and we should be getting some more reviews coming up in the following weeks, so stay tuned for those. But anyway, today we are going to be taking a look at the Neumann NDH-20, and I have them here in the box. So we'll start off with the basic unboxing experience real quick because I thought it was noteworthy this time. So this is the box that you get with the NDH-20. Very nice box with some product photography. You open it up and you are greeted with the headphones here in the foam. And then off here to the side, we're just going to go over the wires real quick for everything else. You get this coiled cable, which I'm not sure exactly how it came in the box. I can't get it to go back in. It just springs itself out. You get a 10-foot straight cable, and you also get a bag, a little carrying bag. So that is nice. All that is included. Of note, apparently this is not the same as like an M40, M50X cable, even though it is a 2.5 millimeter for the headphones side. So you are going to have to find weird specific cables for this. Apparently like the old like HD8 DJ cables work for this, but like M50, M40, 598 style cables apparently don't work for this headphone. So you're going to have a hard time replacing the cable, which you're probably going to do because both of the stock cables are pretty stiff and I don't really like them. And I'm not a huge fan of coiled cables. I really only use the coiled because the 10-foot one was too annoying for me. So not the greatest cables, but nice that it includes a bag. But moving on into the headphones themselves. So here they are. And that is the box. So we will go ahead and get this out of the way. All right, so here we are with the NDH-20. So the Neumann NDH-20 is Neumann's first foray into the headphone world. And Neumann is owned by Sennheiser, for those of you that don't know. So this headphone is using the basic chassis from the Sennheiser HD630VB, which was a portable headphone with like a variable bass slider, which is what VB stands for, variable bass. So they took that chassis because the 630, I've never heard of it, but everything I've heard about it's just a terrible headphone from everything I've ever read about it. So this takes that chassis, and then Neumann did whatever with their drivers, pads, and tuning to make this headphone. So we'll get things going here with some specs like we usually do. So these are a $500 pair of headphones. They are closed back. They are 150 ohms. They have a sensitivity of 114 dB per volt. They weigh 390 grams, and they have a 38 millimeter driver, and that is about all the relevant specs for these. So now on into the build of the NDH-20. So for a $500 build, they actually seem to hold up quite well. They're pretty much metal all around, metal cups, metal here, metal on the top of the headband. This is all metal. So a lot of metal in the basic construction. So the build does feel pretty solid for the price point. Like the twist of the cups feels really smooth, and the pivot of that all feels really, really smooth, really nice. Nice clicky adjustment here for the headband, so all of that is nice. So yeah, the build definitely feels up with a $500 price point. And also of note, they are foldable, so you can fold them up and stick them in that bag. So they're nice for monitoring, which is their intended use. These are a monitoring headphone, not really a general listening headphone. Was not really their intention with these. So overall, build on the NDH-20 is quite good. Okay, so now moving on into the comfort. So the NDH-20 is not the most comfortable headphone out there. Its main issue are pretty shallow, small pads. The pads themselves are like a memory foam. It's a very dense memory foam like a micro suede kind of covering on them. But they are not very deep. They're pretty dense, and they have a very small opening here. Like you can see, just compared to like 2 fingers, how small that opening is. So they do start to hurt your ears. For me, right about an hour is when they start to hurt my ears, and I have worn them for a long time, and I have actually used them for monitoring, which is their intended purpose. So the comfort on these is not great. They didn't seem to hurt the top of my head, but they hurt my ears after about an hour. But for short usage or like some on and off quick usage, they're not too bad in the comfort department. Okay, so now as for power requirements, the NDH-20 is actually surprisingly hard to drive. They seem to be just ever so slightly easier to drive than like HD6XX here, but they do take a decent amount of power to drive, despite their 150 ohms with a decently high sensitivity of 114 dB per volt. So they actually do take some significant power to drive. I did notice on a lot of the things that I have used these for monitoring on, which includes my Scarlett Solo for my videos, and like recorders like a Zoom H6 and F4, that on all those head amps you have to pretty much bring it right near max to get these up to a listening level. So if you have a very weak headphone amp on your device, you might have a problem powering these correctly. So just keep that in mind. And that also means these have an interesting effect with tubes that we will talk about a little bit later in the sound section. But anyway, moving right on into that sound section. So I'm not going to put a ears graph up for these because these are basically impossible to measure on the Mini DSP ears. No matter what you do, any slight change in position changes the FR that the ears gets tremendously. It just looks like 2 different headphones from when you have it one place and then you move it 2 millimeters any direction. The FR looks like it's a 100% different headphone. So there's really no way to measure these, so I'm not going to give you a graph, but that's okay because we don't need graphs to talk about FR. So starting things off with the bass. These extend decently well. They have a little bit of roll off below 50 hertz of, I'd say, 3 or 4 dB. And then they have a little bit of a mid-bass hump also of probably 3 to 4 dB from about 100 to maybe 400 hertz or so. After that, it seems to flatten back off. And then there is a bit of a recession in, I'd say, like the very end of the upper mids and towards the beginning of the lower mids, like that 1K, 2K-ish area. There seems to be a little bit of a recession of maybe 4-ish dB right there. That is kind of interesting. And then after that, right after that, like 1K, 2K dip, everything comes back up. Mostly in line, and there's a little bit of elevation in the treble of around 2 or 3 dB for most of the rest of your treble, with a little bit of a peak like 9-10K-ish. So nothing too crazy, just a little bit of a mid-bass hump with a little bit recession in like your lower upper mids, that like kind of gray area right there, with just a slight little bit of elevated treble for a little bit of sparkle. So keep in mind now that the Neumann here is meant to be a monitoring headphone. It's not really intended for general audiophile listening here. And as a monitor, I think it does do its job quite well, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But for general music listening, I do have a few other problems with these. So the first thing real quick before we get into anything else is a lot of people are going around saying, oh, these things are so neutral. And these are not neutral. They have some color to them. They're definitely not a neutral headphone. Now, Neumann claims that what they were going for with these was to make a headphone that sounds like listening to a pair of Neumann studio monitors. Now, I've never heard a pair of Neumann studio monitors, but if this is what a pair of Neumann studio monitors sounds like, I don't want to hear a pair of Neumann studio monitors. My daily driver studio monitors being Genelec 8030s. But anyway, I also read a post that said that they try to make this a closed back HD 650. I don't know if that's true or not. Just some news article I read about these. So I don't know. All right. But anyway, now that we're done with FR, moving on to other things. So the first thing, we'll talk about dynamics. These are not the most dynamic sounding headphones. They have slightly better dynamics than like the HD 650 here. But for a $500 price point, I expect more for dynamics with these. The bass doesn't have too much impact. It's somewhat woolly and sounds kind of muffled, which is kind of a general thing about these, which we'll talk about in just a second. They definitely get pretty much destroyed in dynamics by one of their, I'd say, somewhat closest competitors, which would be the Fostex X100s, which I know everybody wants me to review these, and I'm getting to it eventually. But anyway, so yeah, dynamics is a little bit lacking here. Detail-wise, they're actually somewhat decent now compared to $500 open backs. I think the 660 out resolves these, but I'd say these are on around the same level of detail of like an HD 650 or 600. So it's acceptable amount of detail, but I wish there was a little bit more for the price, but it's not excessively grainy or anything like a lot of monitors like MDR 7506 or something like that. So detail is somewhat acceptable. Now tonally, these do have a little bit of tonality that reminds me of like the 650 here. They do have that kind of real nice, calm, relaxed, kind of warm tone to them. But timbre is a little bit different. These are not using a 660 driver or a 650 driver. It's a little more plasticky than like a 650, but it's not bad at all. It's definitely one of the more natural sounding timbres out there, so that's quite good. And then as for soundstage, these really don't have much in terms of soundstage. It's very, very small soundstage with the Neumanns here, which seems to be pretty common with studio monitors. I mean, I don't know why that has to be a thing, but yeah, small soundstage like a lot of other studio monitors here. And that also means that imaging is rather poor. I mean, it's such a small stage. It's just not too much in terms of left or right imaging. It's bigger than like an M50X or something, but yeah, it's definitely not a wide sound stage. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and talk about tubes and such. So the NDH-20 for general music listening is not my favorite thing on a solid state amp. The bass sounds kind of like meh, kind of muffled sounding, kind of woolly. The mids are kind of recessed a little bit and just like lack presence. I think the strings are the best part of these. They do strings decently well. Like they're pretty quick strings with nice pluck, like when somebody's plucking some strings with decent detail on them. So I like how these sound for strings, but I don't know, bass and mids on these are just not my favorite. Now, when you put these on a tube amp, the one I used the most was the Eddy Current ZDT Junior from Massdrop with some modified tubes, but I also tried it on Shit Valhalla too. These sound a lot less muffled and stuffy. They give them a little more sense of air and space, and the imaging kind of changes. So they sound a little wider, and whereas on solid state, it sounds like the things you're listening to are like kind of like here right in front of you. This kind of moves them a little more to like here, more off to the side. And they change a lot on a tube amp, which is really surprising. It seems to almost take care of a little bit of that bass bloat, and somehow seems to almost bring up the mids somewhat. I don't know if it's actually bringing up the mids as much as maybe just pulling down the bass and the treble so it sounds more in line. But I really much prefer listening to music on these on a tube amp. Now, that being said, that is not really the intended purpose of these. These are a monitoring headphone. So is it fair to say that, listen to these on a tube amp for a monitoring headphone? That's up to you. But now we'll talk about a few other comparisons here. So the closed-back market is just not a very good market. So finding anything that is even like remotely acceptable is kind of big to me, where these are acceptable, which is really surprising considering that Sennheiser had somewhat of a hand in this, because Sennheiser is notorious for being terrible at making closed-back headphones. So these were probably the things I compared to the most. The 650, because of that article I read saying that they were trying to shoot for like a closed-back version of these. The Neumanns have better bass extension. I think the 650 is slightly warmer than these are. These don't have as much of recession in the mids as these do. These have that weird kind of sharp dip, but this is a little more gradual. The Neumann's a little bit brighter than the 650 is. This is more like maybe like HD 600. But the 650 is a little bit darker. 650 is better soundstage, open back, a little harder to drive. So really not the most fair comparison. I don't really like comparing open and closed, but since that's what one article said they were shooting for, I've had to do it. Tonally, like I said, fairly similar. They're kind of reminiscent of each other, but open versus closed back, so Now, as for monitoring headphones, I mean, M40X, M50X, and M70X, that's all way, way cheaper. These are $500. I would say probably the real fairest competitor would be the Beyerdynamic DT1770, which is also around this price point, also German, because I didn't mention this earlier, but these are made in Germany. I don't like the DT1770. It sounds very muddy, very closed off, very sharp treble. So I just don't like the DT1770 at all personally. And the 177X Go from Drop doesn't look that great either, from what I'm hearing about it. But to me, if you're in it for actual music, I would say this is probably their closest competitor, would be this or the Emutiques. Now, these are kind of more semi-open, and they do leak a decent amount of sound, where these are very, very isolating. These block out a lot of sound, as a good monitoring headphone should. But the X100 is a lot more dynamic. It's certainly bassier, and it's also certainly quite a bit brighter. But overall, for listening to music, I would definitely take the X100 if you can deal with a little bit of leak. Whereas the Neumanns, especially on solid state, are just kind of boring, kind of stuffy sounding. Whereas these are a lot more fun, a lot more engaging, with better dynamics, better bass, better slam, all that kind of stuff. So that is probably the things that I would compare to here. So at the end of the day, the Neumann NDH-20 is going to get a good review from me, because just the closed-back market is so bad. Finding anything that is even remotely acceptable, like I said, is pretty big to me. They sound pretty decent. They do some things well. Like I mentioned, I like them a lot for strings. And I like them a lot more on tubes. So if you have to have a really, really isolating closeback for listening to music, I would try to get these on some sort of tube amp, but try them on solid state. And where I think these are really going to fall into like the market more is for people that seriously use them as a monitor. And I think people are going to use these for like more like a fashion can monitor, almost in a way, which I know sounds kind of dumb. But here's what I mean. So I know for monitoring, you really don't need $500 headphones. I mean, you can really monitor in anything. But where these are, I think, really going to fit a niche for a lot of people is for studio use, with higher-end clients, or even like film sets or something, or I don't know, TV commercial sets, something like that, where you have clientele that know about this kind of stuff. Because these have the Neumann name, that Neumann brand. And these are kind of like a fashiony, they're silver, they're shiny, and they kind of show offy. And they have the Neumann brand. When I was using these for monitoring, I had, the client for the project I was on there asked, well, what headphones are those? Because, they're flashy and they stand out. So they're Neumann. They're like, oh, Neumann, they know what Neumann is. So I think that's really what their niche is. These have that really fancy brand name, because Neumann has that name of high-end microphones, high-end monitors. That's what Neumann is known for. So these fit that kind of niche of high-end brand name fashion can monitoring headphone that's actually somewhat decent, somewhat comfortable, foldable, and I think overall it is a good package. But for straight up audiophile music listening, not my first choice, but if you have to have a very sealed closeback, it gets the pass for me. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of the Neumann NDH-20. Links of where to buy these in the description. No ears graph, so Twitter, contact email, and all other relevant information down in the description. Also, don't forget my 1,000 subscriber design contest and HD 600 giveaway is still going. So I will have that link down in the description as well if you want to enter that. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.